Hello, Sanu Molweni Hujambo. I'm Tembekile Mkhototo, and this is Unwrap Africa, where we focus on the latest news, trends, and successes of the African continent. Siyaqhaqha. And a question to you tonight. A historic G20 Leader Summit has concluded in Johannesburg this Sunday, the first ever on African soil, making it a historic gathering. So what do you make of this G20 that was staged in South Africa this year? We'll take your thoughts on voice note. The WhatsApp number to send them to is +27 8459 1897. You can also find us on Facebook, where we are SABC Unwrap Africa, and on X, we are SABC News_TV. Let's have a look now at the main stories from the continent this week. The 2025 G20 Leaders Summit has ended with no formal handover of the presidency to the United States on the day. Rather, the handover will now happen at the International Relations Department's offices in the week. Yesterday, the G20 leaders adopted the summit declaration without the input of the United States after President Donald Trump decided to boycott the two-day meeting. Uganda's opposition National Unity platform says that police blocked its staff from accessing a planned campaign venue in the key northern city of Arua on Wednesday. Supporters had gathered to welcome the party's 2026 presidential candidate, Bobi Wine, who's continuing a nationwide mobilization ahead of elections in January. Ethiopia has confirmed its first ever outbreak of the Marburg virus, described as a deadly relative of Ebola, while across the continent, cholera is surging at its fastest pace in 25 years. Security forces in northwestern Nigeria are intensifying efforts to find at least 24 young girls who were abducted by gunmen from a school in the early hours of Monday. President Bola Tinubu has called for swift action to return them to safety and says that no effort will be spared in the search. For the first time since 1998, a Moroccan has won the African Ballon d'Or, and this year the honor goes to Achraf Hakimi. The PSG right-back delivered one of the greatest seasons ever by a defender, sweeping every major trophy, including the Champions League, the Ligue 1, and the French Cup, the Trophée des Champions. Well, speaking of the G20 in South Africa this week, Egypt's Foreign Minister Dr. Badr Abdelati is part of an Egyptian delegation that's been attending the meetings in Johannesburg, the first ever hosted on African soil. Abdelati congratulated South Africa for hosting a historic event and highlighted the importance of African leadership and cooperation at the summit. Egypt's Foreign Minister spoke to SABC News special correspondent Sophie Mugwen.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Thankful for our brothers and sisters here in South Africa. Secondly, as for our message, a message that we are proud of South Africa for promoting Africa agenda within the G20, and this is very, very important, and this is not strange for an African leader alongside with Egypt. South Africa is a leading power in Africa alongside with Egypt, with Nigeria and others. So we are very proud to be invited, and we are proud that South Africa is taking the lead, putting Africa agenda and Africa priority on the top of the G20 priorities. And of course, we are, very, very satisfied with the different activities hosted by the South African presidency this year, all over this year, 2025. And again, this is very important, and we have to coordinate our efforts in order to put this nation in the position which is deserved. This is a great nation. This is the only continent in the globe which is going to double its population with high purchasing power, with the expansion of middle class. So I believe that the future is for us. The future is for Africa. And two great nations alongside with Nigeria, we have the three of us and other African countries special responsibilities to promote Africa agenda and to have more regional integrations and put in operation the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is creating more horizon, more opportunities for in doubling our the intra-trade volume among African countries. So again, we are proud of South Africa. We are very grateful, and what you have done over the last this year, I think it's amazing, and God bless you, and God bless South Africa and its brotherly and sisterly people here.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your time.
Thank you for hosting me.
Quite an important discussion there. Egypt, quite a powerful country on the continent, and the work continue in terms of South Africa and Egypt working together in the interest of the developing South.
Meanwhile, the Compact with Africa, launched by the G20, aims to promote private investment and enhance economic cooperation between Africa and other G20 nations. Well, we've been speaking to African leaders, including South Africa's International Relations Minister, Ronald Lamola, about the Compact's outcomes.
The Compact with Africa provides an opportunity to implement the reforms to attract the necessary investments needed to harness the full potential of AfCFTA. More specifically, reforms under the Compact with Africa will help achieve the objectives of the protocol of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement on investment.
When African nations commit to reform, and the G20, along with other international partners, commit to support those efforts with capital, technology, and expertise, a new development pathway becomes possible.
The Compact is important. It is of relevance also for my country. Every year we host the Nordic African Business Summit in Oslo, which has grown to become the biggest event in the Nordic countries to promote investment and business with the continent.
The Compact with Africa 2.0 aims to deepen investment, create jobs, build sustainable prosperity through stronger partnerships with the private sector. We hope that this event further highlighted the importance of the Compact in further unlocking the economic potential of the continent. I would like to thank all speakers for conveying one overarching message of the important and key role players in the partnerships. Cooperation and private sector play in enhancing economic growth, decent jobs, prosperity in Africa and beyond.
The French President Emmanuel Macron, meanwhile, has praised South Africa for hosting a successful G20 Leaders Summit, which has concluded in Johannesburg today.
Of having the first G20 summit in our history on the African continent. And by itself, it's a great achievement. And I think South Africa can be proud of this achievement. Second, this is as well a summit where African Union has a seat, which is a very important achievement as well, in the recognition of Africa as a whole and Africa as being part of these nations to decide for themselves and for the future. Second, the main topic of the G20 is much more about climate, economy, and trying to regulate and find common tools for our economies, and not the vivid and geopolitical crisis. It's never been the core of our agenda, even if in side events we can meet on that. This G20 consolidated some of very important points decided during the past few years, especially on debt restructuring, which was an important part of the discussion this morning. And this is very important in real terms for the African countries, because a lot of them, too many of them, are overwhelmed by the debt service and have to sacrifice health, education because of that. So delivering a common restructuring is critical, and G20 is the right framework. Why? Because you have China, Europeans, all the key creditors around the table. Now, as for the crisis, let me tell you that Sudan is not forgotten by France. All of Sudan and trying to find a way to give to the civil society its fair place and to push and re-engage with the different parties to cease fire. Now, the main objective in Sudan, and I think all those involved in this conflict have to follow the same line, is clearly ceasefire, resuming the humanitarian help, and setting, as we did in 2019, a peace where civil society could take its place and its role. And I do remember the civil society being in Paris in 2019, right after the Sudanese revolution. And these young women were so impressive, so powerful, and we owe them so much.
And still to come on Unwrap Africa, Liesl Wilson, my colleague, brings you a conversation about Africa, debt and inequality in light of that G20 Leaders Summit. Stay with us.
Well, I'm Liesl Wilson for Unwrap Africa. What an exciting time as the G20 Leaders Summit comes to an end. Let's get into this a little bit further. We saw President Cyril Ramaphosa says that the disparities in wealth and development within and between countries are not only unjust and unsustainable, but also one of the greatest impediments to sustainable growth. He's told G20 leaders that it is essential divisions of economic status, gender, race, and geography. So will the G20 countries be able to lead the charge? Let's speak to Kamal Rambututh. He's from the Institute of Economic Justice for more. Kamal, thank you so much for joining us here on Unwrap Africa. Perhaps following the declaration, the consensus of the declaration that's been adopted, do you think the G20 finally has a clear roadmap to tackle inequality?
Liesl, I don't think that there is a clear roadmap whatsoever for the G20 as a whole, as a forum to deal with inequality. But two important things have happened in the G20 over the past couple of years around inequality. The first was last year when the Brazilian government within their G20 put inequality front and center as one of the main priorities of their presidency. And one of the things that we saw coming out of that was a declaration on the tax of the ultra wealthy. So that was the first kind of a step towards making some real progress. But of course, these declarations are voluntary and non-binding. And so countries aren't necessarily obligated to implement the things that they have put forward in those communiques and declarations. And because the G20 doesn't really have a coordinating secretariat or any instruments itself to implement international taxation, what it does is it makes recommendations to other forums. So, for example, the G20 Leaders Declaration noted the ongoing process in the United Nations to develop a UN framework on taxing multinational corporations and looking at base erosion. And then this year, what the South African government did is, put inequality forward through the Task Force 1, looking at how, inclusive growth relates to inequality. What happened yesterday during the plenary of the leaders is there was the presentation of a panel report done by an extraordinary panel of experts that was chaired by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz. And this report was presented, of course, to all of the heads of states that were there, who therefore had to engage with some of the ideas contained in this report. And there were a number of really interesting and really powerful ideas and policy proposals in that report. There's about 14 proposals in that report, and they're wide-ranging across intellectual property. It's looking at digital access, food buffer stocks, public price regulation of food prices, competition policy and regulation of monopolies and oligopolies that shoot prices up, that make things like food very expensive for the rest of us. They looked at ending illicit financial flows. We know that there's at least $88 billion that leaves the African continent every year through illicit financial flows. So it's looking at that as well. So it wasn't just focused on taxing multinational corporations and the ultra wealthy. It looked at things that would create structural reform, looking at capital controls for member states, looking at special drawing rights allocations from the IMF and how those should be structured and distributed, and looking at how do you rewrite the rules of trade for local benefication.
Kamal, let me come in there, and thank you so much for speaking to that, because yes, given the non-binding nature, we also have to look at the checks and balances. What is needed to make sure that the world does not regress further and widen the gap between the rich and the poor? How would you weigh in from your vantage point?
So, I mean, of course, as you're saying, it's difficult to implement in a coordinated way, especially now as we're seeing a fracturing of multilateralism throughout the world. We're seeing the largest countries not pitching up to the G20, right? We're seeing, things like the Oceans Treaty, things like the Financing for Development 4 conference in Sevilla earlier this year. We're seeing things like the G20 now, where some of the largest economies, some of the biggest, most powerful countries, the USA in particular, has chosen not to come, right? And so it's difficult to make global rules in the absence of some of the biggest players. But what we are seeing is that the show is going on. And those who are willing, to create the coalitions to go on with issues like addressing climate change, to go on with issues like gender equality, to go on with, seeking out the Sustainable Development Goals as a North Star for, developmental outcomes.
And Kamal,
those countries who believe in those things are kind of, working around it to advance that agenda.
There's a plethora of issues, as we've seen, and we're obviously looking at this reform of global financial or funding institutions, how necessary they become. But what shape and form should they ultimately be taking for Africa to particularly avoid sinking deeper into debt? Please wrap up succinctly.
Sure. No, it's a really fundamental question, and it's a question at the core of the G20, because ultimately the G20 was created to look at economic growth and financial stability. And the only real anchors for the only real institutions where that work happens are places like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the New Development Bank, the African Development Bank. And so those kind of institutions are really important. One of the problems with the bigger, older institutions that were built after World War II, like the IMF and World Bank, is that they do not reflect the current economic power that middle-income countries and upper-middle-income countries have, and they do not adequately protect the lowest-income countries. Most low-income countries have pretty much no say whatsoever in these institutions. And so one of the key reforms is to increase the quota for the smallest countries to a higher basis level, and to reduce the dominance of old hegemonic powers to reflect, a global order that has huge countries from the BRICS and other middle-income countries that are playing a bigger role in the international financial architecture.
Well, Kamal, we're going to have to see how this all plays out and how quickly all of that is responded to. Kamal Rambututh, thank you for your time from the Institute for Economic Justice weighing in.
Thank you so much. Take care.
A reminder now of the question on Unwrap Africa this evening. With the G20 summit having concluded in Johannesburg today, we want to know from you, what do you make of a historic G20 leaders gathering, the first one on the African continent? Let's look at comments from X first. We've got one here from Opa, who says that the United States wanted to isolate South Africa to supremacy ideology, but ended up being isolated themselves. I wonder what their next move will be. Mrs. Al says that he did well, or better yet, ask his PA to do the handing over level to level. That's with regards to how South Africa will now use the Durban office to hand over officially the chairpersonship of the G20 to the Americans this coming week. Mnyamezeli says, bold move. President Ramaphosa showed true leadership and is not accepting bullying of unhinged President of the United States. The truth is, the US government, according to Mnyamezeli, always looking for war and confusion all over the world. Someday, all deceptions and tricks by the US government will come to a stop. War is near, warns Mnyamezeli. Chimpi says that presence is a political courtesy, not a legal requirement. Even if the next host is absent, South Africa will still hand over. The rotation remains valid, and the incoming host can announce priorities afterwards. So much of the focus still to do with the American no-show at the highest levels, if you will, of their government for the G20 gathering. Someone here who goes by the pseudonym Minister Without Portfolio says Donald Trumps must be angry wherever he is. And Langas Oberholzer says that the US is likely to ask for it to be FedExed. So tonight on Unwrap Africa, we've given you the views of the leaders from Egypt. We've heard from the French, President Ramaphosa, as well as host of the G20 Leaders Summit, speaking about the important summit this week. We want you to take a listen now to perspective from Germany's ambassador to South Africa as the summit concludes.
Tovera, Bachwera Kamoka. Gena Andreas Peschke, German ambassador to South Africa. Here in South Africa, we are all set for the G20 summit in South Africa. So let's be clear. This summit is a historic event. The South African presidency has done a wonderful job over the past year. Germany supports the priorities of the South African presidency, like the focus on climate financing, like the focus on reducing and easing the debt burden for developing countries in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And then we want to use the Compact with Africa, which is a G20 initiative co-chaired by South Africa and Germany, which is supposed to boost private investment on the continent. Transakazi, let's roll. Let's have a great summit. Masambeni, Maipumeleli Summit.
The German ambassador to South Africa emphasizing his country's commitment to the G20 and the relationship with South Africa, bringing us to an end of this edition of Unwrap Africa. We're back with you next week, 8 p.m. right here on SABC News. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.